thank you so much for joining us for our final webinar in our career series. We are going to be going over a ton of information covering the much stressed about job interview. We hope that you'll leave here with a better understanding of the differences between online and in-person interviews, providing unique answers for common questions, and giving yourself an honest self-evaluation and much more. I'm once again joined by two of our webinar regulars, Rachel Eckman and Dr. Amy Dietzman, who will be presenting and sharing all this information to you. So without further ado, Amy, I'll pass it on over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Maxine. Welcome, everybody. Rachel and I are so excited today to do this interview webinar with you. We both love interviews. Not really, but we love talking about them. So let's talk a little bit about the previous webinars we did. Maxine just told you that if you missed any of these, you're welcome to find them on our YouTube channel. We did a career transition into resumes and cover letters presentation earlier this month. And we are also going to kind of like remind you of a couple things we talked about in these previous webinars at the end today. I'm going to give you a little dish about some things I've recently noticed as I've actually been hiring people. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. Today, we are going to start by preparing you. What do you need to do to prepare for the interview before you even get the interview? And then once you're told, yes, you get an interview, what are all the things you should be doing? Next is the execution. So we'll talk through what you're actually doing in the interview. We'll do a little mock interview for you. We're really excited to show you how it's actually done. So Rachel and I are going to work together. We're going to show you how to do an interview. And then what do you do after the interview? This part always trips me up. So we're going to talk a little bit about do's and don'ts for that. And then at the end, we're going to do some commonly asked questions. I have questions I've always wondered. So I brought my burning questions to ask Rachel. And in addition, we'll give you some time at the end to ask your questions. So please feel free to get those questions ready as we go. So now I'm going to pass it over to Rachel, who's going to get us started a little bit on before you even have that interview, what should you be doing?
Thank you, Amy. The best time to start planning and preparing for a job interview is before you actually start applying for jobs. The average job search lasts about 5 or 6 months, and it can get tedious. The application process often feels redundant, and waiting for responses can become frustrating. You just want to fast forward to the part where you start your new job. At this point, you may start to think the best thing to do is apply for as many jobs as you can to expedite the process and increase your chances of being hired. Try to resist the urge to do that because applying for too many jobs can actually do more harm than good. You run the risk of becoming fatigued with the process to the point where you're not taking the time and care you should when completing those applications. And now you're actually reducing your chances of a callback. And then there's another consideration. What happens when you apply for 15 or 20 jobs at the same time as you're applying for those really great dream jobs, those top couple, and then one of the other employers calls you first? Now you need to decide if you should or can even afford to turn down a potential job offer, or if you're going to have to just walk away from that dream job. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you take the time to plan out your job search, you can set yourself up to achieve your career goals with as little stress as possible. Apply for your top choice jobs first, then stagger all your following applications, giving yourself a little bit of buffer time for those top choices to get back to you. Things to consider when prioritizing those jobs are location, scheduling, salary, of course, benefits, organizational culture, career goals. Look at each job from a holistic perspective and then rate it based on all those factors. But also take into consideration some factors in your chances of getting a call back from the organization. How long has the job been posted? If the job posting has been up longer than a few months, it's quite possible that that's a dormant listing. How many other applicants have already applied? Some job search sites will give you that information. If there have been hundreds of applicants before you, certainly still apply if you really love the job, but keep in mind that they may actually already be interviewing for that position, so your chances may be a little lower. I recommend using an actual tracker to keep records of your search and help you to follow up and plan next steps. Track the dates you submit each application so that if, after a prescribed length of time, you haven't heard back, you can follow up with the company or unfortunately ultimately move on if you still don't get a call back. Other things you may want to include in the tracker are the link to the posting, so you can revisit it if you'd like, the date that the job was posted, the position title, any notes that might be important to you. You can also include a column for follow-up dates. And if you're a little Excel savvy, you can use formulas to automatically calculate those dates. Organizing and even automating aspects of your job search will make the whole process more positive. Tracking your applications is also a great idea if you plan to apply again in the future. You don't get the spot this time around, but in a year or two, when your top choice company has another opening, you want to try again. Having details of your previous application to provide on a cover letter or in an interview will demonstrate real dedication to the pursuit of your goals. Okay, let's fast forward. You got the call you've been waiting for, you're ready to schedule your interview. If the company presents you with a date and time that you aren't 100% sure works for you, it's okay to say, I would be thrilled to come and interview, but I'd like to double check my schedule and confirm with you later on if that's all right. It's always better to avoid rescheduling if you can. And then just be sure to get a name and callback number and call back as soon as possible to confirm or request a different time. When you schedule, ensure that you leave yourself a nice, comfortable buffer zone around that appointment. Try not to schedule your interview for, say, 2 p.m., knowing you have to be somewhere at 3:30 p.m. You need to leave room for variables like delays in the start of the interview, running long during the interview, and of course, traffic leaving. And the last thing you want to be doing during a job interview is checking the time. You should also avoid scheduling more than one interview in a day. If you can, try to be fresh for each interview you go on. If you book them back to back and your first interview doesn't go as well as you'd hoped, that can really cloud your disposition and frame of mind going into the next interview. Similarly, if you leave that first interview thinking you've got it in the bag, maybe you'll be less attentive to the next one and not give it your all. The best option is to spread them out a little bit and then use that to your advantage. If there was something you thought you might have done differently or answered better, now you have the opportunity to plan for that the next time around. Which brings us to the next critical step in preparing for your interview, getting ready to actually answer those questions. And Amy's going to kick us off on that one.
Awesome. All right. So let's get into some things that you should be doing to prepare for your interview. Before you go into any interview, it's important to first inform your why. Why do you actually want to work there? The best way to figure this out is to do your research and start with your friends. If you're lucky enough to know someone who works at the company already, make a list of questions and ask them to meet you for coffee or jump on a phone call and talk you through your burning questions. If possible, maybe they can give you some insight into the interview process, or maybe they'll tell you some interesting information about the person who's interviewing you or people on the team that you might be working with. These are all things you'll want to know. Also, when your interview is scheduled, find out who it is that's interviewing you. Look them up on LinkedIn and see if there's a way you can make a connection with them during the interview. Is there something you have in common? How did they get into their position? Have they moved up in the company? Does it appear that there are growth opportunities there? These are all things that you're going to want to know as you're determining, is this place you really want to work? Obviously, but also not so obviously, look at the company's website. Click all around the website and understand the company's mission and their vision. Where did the founders come from? How has the company grown? What is the company focused on? And then use this information in the interview. Refer to what you've learned to demonstrate that you took the time to do your research. Then look at press releases. What has the company been up to? Did they recently lay people off? Can you find an earnings report? Is the company doing well financially? These are also important things to know. And lastly, look at reviews. Now remember to take these with a grain of salt. These are Sometimes just people who are angry, but look at Glassdoor, look at the Better Business Bureau or Reddit and see what employees are saying about the company and its leaders. Now that you've done all that research, now you need to get ready for the type of interview that you're going to be engaged in. So let's talk about a few different types. Aside from the basic one-on-one that you might engage in, you might also do a panel interview, which is very common and includes, like it sounds, a panel of interviewers. When you're going to be in this type of interview, it's good to know who will be there so you can research them. It's also always a good idea to bring several copies of your resume with you so that you can give each interviewer a copy. A couple of tips for this type of interview. We tend to turn our attention to certain people who may be smiling or nodding, giving us some kind of positive affirmation. You just want to be careful of that. Make sure you're looking at everyone at the table. Give every person your attention. And if you're able to, prepare questions for each of the interviewers, because remember, in a panel interview, there are many decision makers there. Competency-based interviews. This interview type allows potential employees to identify key competencies of a potential employee. More than likely, these types of questions will be sprinkled throughout any interview. And you'll probably recognize the type of question. Think of like the ones that say, describe how you have positively contributed to a team. Have you ever received negative feedback from a manager and how did you handle it? Or describe a difficult situation you resolved at your current position. So you want to think through what your answer is saying about you. For example, if someone asks you to describe how you have positively contributed to a team, they are looking to see if you are a team player and collaborator. They're asking you to describe your problem-solving capabilities in case maybe there was a sticky situation in a group project that you did. Or maybe they want you to talk about your leadership capabilities if you worked on a team where you took on the leadership role during that big project. Be cautious of just answering with, yes, I've worked on a team before. At my last job, there were 5 product managers, and sometimes we did stuff together. Now, you might think that sounds ridiculous, but I have heard similar responses to this question on numerous occasions, more occasions than I would like to disclose. Also, case interviews. Let's talk about those. They can vary by industry, and you will more than likely know ahead of time if you're walking into an interview like this, which will help you determine what tools you might need to bring along with you. In this situation, the interviewer is looking for you to think on your feet, ask pertinent questions, problem solve, think outside the box, and present your ideas with confidence. So I'll give you an example. I interviewed for a curriculum and assessment specialist position many years ago at a school district. One of my tasks was going to be to train teachers. So after my panel interview, I was taken into another room with a laptop and was told I had 45 minutes to create a training for teachers on Common Core standards for English language arts. They gave me a flash drive and told me to create a PowerPoint and save my PowerPoint to the flash drive and leave it on the table. That was it. That's the only direction I was given. So I had to ask a few questions, narrow it down, come up with something much more focused, and build something impressive showing that I understood the basic tenets of adult learning theory, standards like Common Core standards, obviously I had to know those, and English language arts. Now, when I did that case interview, there were 2 other people in the room at the same time, which was slightly unnerving, I will say, but that was an example of a case that I had to solve. All right, so let me pass it back over to Rachel, who's going to talk a little bit about in-person and online interviews.
If you're interviewing for a remote position, it's of course more than likely that you'll do a virtual interview. If you're interviewing for an on-location position, you'll probably be invited to the office, but it could actually go either way because some companies will conduct the first round of interviews virtually and then do second interviews in person. When you're invited to interview, you'll find out which one to expect, and as soon as you find out, you can begin preparing. no matter what type of interview you're going into, virtual, in person, one on one, panel, there are some things that are universally true. This may sound obvious, but it's very important to know the content of your resume backwards and forwards. You'd be surprised how often people stumble when questioned about something that's on their own resume. You also don't want to go into an interview without some fundamental knowledge about the company you're interviewing for. No matter how qualified you are, employers will be quite put off if you have no familiarity with their organization. If you're able, prepare some kind of anecdote or example of the company's history that really appealed to you and speaks to your desire to join their team. Something like, ever since I read that 2008 article about your organization's reinvention of the peer to peer client network, I knew I wanted to be a part of this team so I could experience and participate in that level of innovation. I also highly encourage you to do a little bit of reading about inclusive language and best practices before going into an interview. Nothing will upend your chances for employment faster than actually offending or insulting the interviewer. There are a lot of expressions and terms that are commonly used despite their really unfortunate history or etymology, and being unaware doesn't do anything to lessen the potential offense. So just get a little bit up to speed on what's considered professionally appropriate in today's workplace. You may think it's much easier to do an online interview than an in-person interview, but really there's just as much to consider and plan for when you're conducting an interview virtually. Because now you're not just responsible for your own appearance, but also for the space that you're in, your technology compatibility, and your internet connection. And of course, the nonverbal elements of your first impression will be very different. Let's start with the interview space. The right space for your interview is not going to be your car, your bathroom, a restaurant or bar, Walmart, or the closet in your current office. And if you're laughing at my examples, like Amy, these are not made up. Remember that where you choose to conduct your interview is going to tell the interview a lot about your idea of professionalism as it applies to a virtual working environment. If I'm interviewing candidates for a remote position and the applicant has a particularly noisy background, an unkempt working space, unstable internet connection, poorly operating equipment, inappropriate things in their background, I am going to immediately begin making assumptions about their ability to self-regulate in a remote working environment. Now, anyone who's been working remote for long enough will tell you they have almost certainly been guilty of some or all of those things at least a few times. But this is your very first impression. You wouldn't take a crying baby, a pile of laundry, your hairbrush, and some dirty dishes into an interview office. You need to plan your virtual space to be just as professional as if you were there in person. A virtual background is fine, but that also needs to be professional. And even if you plan to use one, it's a really good idea to make sure that your space is interview ready just in case. Because what if the platform you're using doesn't allow virtual backgrounds? Your best bet is just a clean wall behind you, very little decor, nothing particularly personal, religious, political. You want to be seated in a chair with a back so that you're sitting up nice and straight, and clear your desk or table of anything except your computer or laptop, pen and paper to take notes, and a copy of your resume. As soon as you find out what actual application the interview will be in, Zoom, Cisco, Teams, whatever, you want to test that on your laptop or computer. And then a few hours before the interview, you want to test it again. Imagine you're about to enter an online interview and Zoom decides it just has to do some update that's then going to require you to restart your computer in order for it to work. Or if the interview uses an online meeting space that you've never used and the download then takes forever. Or you find out as you're trying to download that your laptop can't support that platform. Remember, being at least somewhat tech savvy is going to be a big part of working online, so you don't want to appear unable to get the technology to work. Be sure that your connection is good, your equipment is ready before you're scrambling to get into the meeting on time. It can be very tempting to get a little comfortable in an online interview, much more so than you would in an in-person interview, but you need to resist the temptation. The only things that should be in your space and within your reach are the things that you would carry with you into the interview. This means no food, drinks, gum, candy. Leave your cell phone in another room on silent. Close all your other browsers and programs. If you're on a laptop or computer, the only thing that should be open is the meeting window. You should have a printed copy of your resume in front of you. And this way, if they ask specific questions about your resume, you can see exactly what they're referring to without having to try to pull up a file on your laptop. And dress completely for the interview. I know that the whole office appropriate top with sweatpants and slippers is a really funny meme, but the truth is that if you're wearing casual clothing, it will have a negative effect on your posture. If you're dressed in full professional outfit, top to bottom to include shoes, it will cause you to conduct yourself differently. You'll have better posture, you'll be more focused, and you'll be both consciously and subconsciously in a more professional mindset. Body language is tricky online. There are nonverbal cues that are difficult to read when in an online environment, which also means that there's a higher likelihood of an interviewer misreading them. I'll give you a personal example. I am from New York and we are hand-arm talkers. I gesticulate emphatically while I'm speaking. It's an ingrained part of my communication style, and I'm doing it right now, even though you can't see me. But think about what that looks like to the person on the other side of the screen in an interview, because they only mostly see my head and upper torso. So it probably looks like I'm bouncing around and wiggling a little bit oddly, and that has a very different effect on the conversation. It may make me look a little comical, or worse, it may make me look like I'm doing something else. Maybe it looks like I'm Googling as I talk or multitasking. Maybe it looks like I'm nervous and fidgeting. A great solution for this is to hold something in your lap out of the view of the camera with both hands, not something that will lead to more movement like a fidget spinner or a toy, but a small ball, perhaps an empty teacup, even a child's sippy cup, the kind that has two handles, could work. Something to just help you keep centered, stable, and sitting still. And be mindful of your gaze as well. If you've been looking in the same spot on the screen, presumably the face of the interviewer, and then suddenly your gaze shifts or begins to drift, it definitely looks like you're on another screen or no longer paying full attention. Posture and gaze will also be very important in the in-person interview. The in-person interview is not more or less complicated than online, but it is very different. You don't have to worry about your space, which is great. You don't have to worry about connection or equipment, but you do need to be even more careful about your attire and, of course, plan travel. Make sure you have reliable transportation and you arrive on time. And by on time, I do mean 15 minutes prior to the scheduled start time. And despite what the picture on your screen shows, don't bring a drink or a travel mug of any kind into the office. In one hand, you should be carrying your briefcase or portfolio, and the other should be free to shake hands with your interviewer. Have at least one or two working pens and at least 2 copies of your resume or more for a panel interview, as Amy explained earlier. You need a notepad, something to write on, and that's where you'll have your prepared questions written down as well. Your phone should be off, really off. But if you must have your phone on, it needs to be completely silent and not on vibrate. And I would suggest never taking it out of your pocket or briefcase or purse ever. Truly, if you're driving, I just recommend leaving it in the car. But if that's not an option, keep it completely out of sight from the moment you step into the building to the moment you step out of the building, because the interview is not over until you've left the building. Something else to think about is cologne or perfume. It sort of goes without saying that your personal hygiene is part of your first impression. You want to be showered and in a clean, appropriate outfit with a clean, appropriate hairstyle, but you also may want to consider skipping the fragrances. Interview rooms are often smaller spaces. Many people don't like overpowering fragrances, and if your interviewer has a sensitive nose or allergies, You could literally make them physically uncomfortable. So deodorant, yes. Other fragrances, I really recommend against. Now that you're dressed and ready to go, it's time to get down to brass tacks, the actual questions. There is no way of knowing in advance what will be asked during an interview, but that doesn't mean you can't be prepared. There are some very common questions you can anticipate, and most of them will be about your previous work experience, expertise in the field, and technical or relevant knowledge. And of course, there's going to be an icebreaker. The tell me about yourself question is asked in some variation or another in nearly every interview, and it trips so many people up. It's an icebreaker question, so it's always the first one asked, which also makes it the most important because it can set the tone for your entire interview. One small overshare or the reveal of something personal that opens up a door for bias, and you can upend your entire interview before it even really begins. The key to the icebreaker is to keep it completely professional. Of course, there's so much more to you than just your professional persona, but this interview is strictly about work. You're presenting your professional self for evaluation and consideration for a job. So the information that's relevant to that is the only information you're going to reveal in your answer to this question. There are a lot of other common questions that you may be asked. And again, you can't predict which ones you'll get, but most of the questions will be geared toward ensuring that your credentials align with the needs of the organization. So find ways to tie your professional experience into those needs using anecdotes and examples. Before you go in, think of a few things that you can talk about that really paint a picture of how you stand out. Like that one time that the company received a last minute request from a very important client, and you were able to tweak a previous project to meet their needs and save the day. The client was so impressed that they signed a 2-year extension and requested to have you as their personal point of contact. When I was younger, there used to be a joke. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer was practice, practice, practice. Okay, so maybe it's not as funny as I remember, but the message really still applies. The best way to get great at something is to practice. And that includes your job interview. Just practice talking about your professional qualifications over and over. Use the mirror, use a friend, your mom, your dog, anyone who will humor you. You'd be surprised how a little repetition can go a long way to help you remain composed if you're nervous and put on the spot. And speaking of practice, let's give it a shot.
Okay, let's do it. So we're going to do a little mock interview with Rachel. Let's put Rachel to the test and hear what some really good responses to commonly asked questions sound like. We tried to pick the kinds that we think you might want to hear, the ones that you might trip you up a little bit. So let's start with the one we just talked about. Hey, Rachel, tell me about yourself.
I have been a counselor of sorts most of my professional career. While in the military, one of my primary responsibilities was to train, mentor, and coach my soldiers. While working at the college, my focus was on helping my students to achieve their career goals. And even now, while my primary responsibilities are more administrative, I've still managed to carve out a little niche for myself that incorporates my enthusiasm for career services through webinars and newsletters. For me, I think helping others achieve their goals and reach their true potential is as much of a passion and calling as it is a professional field. When I'm able to help others through my work, I really, truly just love what I do.
Whew, so good. Notice Rachel didn't say how old she was. She didn't tell us that she's a mom of a 2-year-old. She stuck to her professional experiences. So that is what you want to do when you get asked this question. All right, so let's go to another one. Rachel, tell us, why are you leaving your current job?
I don't really want to leave my current organization as much as I just feel ready to pursue the next steps in my career path. My current position has provided me with an invaluable amount of experience and opportunity for growth and professional development. And it's largely because of those experiences that I feel I'm ready to make this move and take the next step toward my long term goals.
That was great. Rachel answered that really well for a few reasons. Well, she didn't talk negatively about her current employer or that boss that she can't stand. She kept it positive and explained that she is ready for the next step. She's motivated and ambitious, which is great. How about this one? This is one that I ask people a lot. So let's see how Rachel answers it. How can you help your manager manage you?
My professional love language, so to speak, is words of appreciation. And that really speaks to my needs when it comes to being managed. I think I thrive in an environment with less micromanagement. I really like to have direction with detailed end goals in both metrics and purpose. Once I know what and why, I love the creative part of problem solving and planning. And I do appreciate periodic, honest feedback. I can take any measure of constructive criticism as long as there's also genuine acknowledgement of my contributions.
That's good. So I do ask this one a lot, and it's interesting to me how many times people answer this with, I hate micromanaging, but then they describe micromanaging. I like a boss who checks in with me multiple times a day. I don't mind sending daily reports with my progress on all of my projects. Rachel's answer was honest, and she described being a self-motivated person. She said she was creative. She said she likes feedback, but she doesn't need a manager checking up on her all the time, and that's great. Every employer likes someone who can get the job done with minimal supervision, and I think that's what Rachel just told us. All right, so now, most of you have probably been asked the question, tell me about your professional strengths. And we're all pretty good at that one. But then the flip side one comes up, and that is, what are your weaknesses? So Rachel, how would you answer this one?
I think one of my greatest weaknesses is really actually enthusiasm. I tend to get a little tunnel vision when it comes to something that I identify as the best course of action or plan, even when it's not necessarily what the team or the group has in mind. So I can be a bit aggressive when it comes to convincing others of my point of view. But I feel that I do take redirection humbly enough, and I can continue with enthusiasm and positivity moving forward, even if it's not my original idea. And since I'm aware of it, I do try to tread a little more gently and really listen to those around me so as not to step on any toes. I love working as a part of a team. So I also just try to make sure my team knows that, even if I am occasionally a little too persistent.
This is a tough question. Most people try to take a negative and turn it into a positive. So 95% of the people I interview say, I'm a perfectionist. But for all the times I've heard this answer, there really aren't that many perfectionists out there in the world. And it's okay to say you have a weakness because nobody's perfect. You know it's there and you're working to address it, which is what Rachel just said. She knows that there's times when maybe she's really excited about something and she thinks that this is one way everybody should go, and then it's not. So she has to tell her team, hey, it's okay. Tell me to slow down and I will. So you know your weakness is there. You're working to address it. Nobody expects perfection from a person. So it's okay to say you have a weakness. It's better than saying you're a perfectionist. Let me just put it that way. I'm really tired of hearing that. And I think that everybody has read somewhere on the internet that that's the best answer. And it's not anymore. Maybe it was 10 years ago. It's not anymore. All right. That was awesome. Thank you, Rachel.
And thank you, Amy, for considering me for the position.
Oh, yes, you got the job. I would like to take a little time to do a little dish. I'm going to dish some do's and don'ts from the many years I've been hiring people. So let's start with a don't that follows something Rachel already said about cell phones. One time I did an interview in person with a guy, and he was hunched over his phone in the waiting room. And when I came to invite him back to my office, he didn't even look up from his game or whatever he was doing when I walked into the room. First impression from me was he wasn't sitting up straight and he did not make eye contact. He did not seem very confident. Needless to say, he didn't get the job. So here are a couple of application do's. So we're going to go back to kind of before the interview process, and you fill out an application. Here are my do's. Do fill out the entire application. Do not put see resume in the fields. And I know how annoying it is to have to fill in an application when you've already typed all the answers into your resume. But I just recently realized why it is so important. I just hired someone just last week from a pool of over 1,000 applicants. The amount of resumes and applications I had to go through was so overwhelming that all I did for the first screening was just look at the application questions where experience and education were listed. If something intrigued me, only then did I actually open the resume and then the cover letter. So the application was super critical in this scenario. If someone didn't fill it out, I never even saw anything. Do put the right salary if you're asked in the application what your salary requirements are. So if I'm hiring for a job that pays 50,000 and it lists 50,000 in the posting, yet someone puts that their salary requirement is 70,000, I'm going to eliminate that candidate based on that number alone. So if 50,000 doesn't work for you and you need to make 70,000, don't apply for that job. Or don't assume that you can get more money simply by putting it in the application. Right now, the job market is just too competitive for that. So I eliminated a lot of people because they put too much money. A couple of tips for your resume now. So let's go to resume. Do update the summary section for the job. Don't put that you're a data analyst looking to transition to a career in cybersecurity, but then apply for a job as a project manager. See, when I'm hiring, if I see that, I immediately think, well, this isn't really the job that you want. You just applied for something randomly. Also, don't put generic bullets in your resume that are obvious to everyone. For example, don't put that you were a math teacher at Deer Valley Unified School District and then list in a bullet that you taught math to 37 students. Math teacher teaching math is implied. So put the other things you did that were outside of the normal scope that show your other skills and qualifications, like did you lead professional development? Were you on some specific committee that applies to this position? Did you write curriculum? Those are things that go beyond just the basic, I taught math. And last, I have an interview tip for you. Do answer the questions succinctly and know when to stop talking. We interview people all the time who keep talking and talking, hoping that they will eventually say absolutely everything we want to hear. Rambling, though, is a huge turnoff. Know when you've said enough and stop. And also smile during your interview. I can't tell you how many times I interview people and maybe they're nervous, but they don't smile. And that also turns me off. I want someone who is warm and who at least can smile and say, nice to meet you. So another thing you want to do is ask questions. So let's move on to some questions that you're going to ask of the interviewer. This is often neglected, and everybody wants to know the basic things like, what is your timeline for hiring this position? When are you going to make a decision? When will I hear from you? Those are great questions. Everybody asks those. But let's think about really what's most important to you. Don't ask questions just because you think they will make you look smart. Ask questions that show you're thoughtful and sincere, or questions that are going to help you make a decision about possibly accepting a position there. So consider the culture of the organization. And it's great to ask your interviewers, why do they like working there? Ask questions about your role. What does a typical day look like? How would you gauge success in this role? Or one question that I've heard several times recently that I think is really good. Are there any areas where you feel I might lack the necessary skills or experience for this role? This is great because you're asking for feedback right then and there, and it's going to help you to know whether or not you're actually qualified, or maybe even if you're not qualified, you might know right then and there. They might say, well, we're looking for somebody with this, this, and this. And if you don't have those things, well, at least you know right then. Team. Well, does it really matter to you what the team is like that you will be working with? Will you have a job where you have to collaborate with others a lot? These could be critical questions for you. And how about learning? Are you looking for a company that invests in employee growth and understands the importance of training? So it's okay to say, are there professional development opportunities here? What does the onboarding process look like? These are important questions as well. So again, what's important to you? And a couple of quick tips here. Do not ask questions that you could have easily found by Googling or looking on the company's website. You don't ever want to highlight the fact that you came unprepared. Also, don't ask questions about raises or bonuses unless you're at the salary negotiation stage of the application process. All right, so you did the interview. What do you do after? Let's pass it over to Rachel for some more tips.
Thank you, Amy. Following up with a job offer isn't required, but it will set you apart from your peers and make you look dedicated to the job opportunity with that organization. There are 2 times you'll want to follow up: with a thank you note directly after the interview, and then later on if you haven't heard back with an offer yet. And there are a few things you want to keep in mind. The thank you part of the follow-up should be within a day, or it'll be a little too late to make an impact. So when you leave the interview, follow up later that day or the very next morning with an email thanking them for their time, offering any additional information or documentation they may need, and expressing your enthusiasm to be considered for the position. You can also mention anything that you forgot to say in the interview as long as it's relevant to your qualifications for the position. Be sure to keep it professional and appropriate. Even if you had a friendly rapport during the interview, don't make the mistake of being too casual in your follow-up email. Then you can do a little ping a week or 2 later to remind them that you're interested if you haven't already heard back. Keep it simple and polite. And if you do receive a rejection email at any point, it's a great idea to respond back. Thank them for the opportunity to interview and tell them that you'd love to be considered for future positions that come available. Even if you don't land the job, it's always still wonderful to make that connection for professional networking. It's perfectly acceptable to decline an offer if it isn't the best choice for you, as long as you do it the right way. One of the most important aspects about declining an offer is to be clear about your reason for declining and whether or not you're willing to negotiate. No matter what, be very polite. Keep it positive, and again, thank them for the opportunity. Keep the connection open to future professional networking or employment opportunities. Applying for a job interview and then being offered the position is the basic desired outcome for the whole process, but it's still a major decision and not one that should be taken lightly. So there are a few considerations before accepting an offer. Just because the job seeking process can be challenging doesn't mean you have to compromise what you want and what you need. We use the term work-life balance a lot, but it goes beyond that. Think of your employment from a holistic perspective. Salary is, of course, incredibly important, but compensation for work is about so much more than salary. What does your healthy work-life balance look like? Does that mean a great benefits package, room for growth, being able to pick your kids up from school every day? Whatever it is, make sure you're advocating for yourself when you get to the point of an offer. Most importantly, know that that next incredible job is out there. So good luck and happy hunting.
Okay, so I had some burning questions that I'm going to ask. In the meantime, if you all want to be sending your questions in the Q&A section, in the little box that says Q&A, please do. And we will be happy to answer some of your questions as well. If we run out of time, we can make an FAQ document and send it to you. So if we have a lot of questions, we'll do that. But here are a couple of questions I have for you, Rachel. Should you apply for multiple job openings at the same company? What does that say about you if you do that?
That's a great question, and it is a 2-part answer. It can say different things. If you apply for 2 different job openings at the same company that are counterintuitive, it doesn't look good. And what do I mean by counterintuitive? So if you apply for an opening as an executive assistant or an administrative assistant, and then you apply for another opening as a project manager, now you're applying for 2 very opposing positions. One is an assistant position and one is a management position. So it makes the company pause and say, well, which one of these are you qualified for? Are you qualified to be an assistant or are you qualified to be a manager? That I wouldn't recommend doing. If you're applying for very similar positions, absolutely, there's no harm in doing that as long as they make sense based on your experience and expertise and qualifications, as long as they're parallel positions, if you will. But I would also suggest mentioning something about it in your cover letter or in the application somewhere. Put a note that says, I'm so eager to work for your organization and you have these two great positions, both of which I'm qualified for. And I want you to know I've applied for both. And I would love to interview for either or both.
Great. I always wonder about that. Okay, so this is another question I had, and it kind of goes along with a question that somebody asked in the chat. What do you do when the salary isn't posted and they don't reveal it in the interview? Do you ask? When do you negotiate salary?
That's a great question. And it comes up all the time because a lot of people feel very uncomfortable trying to fit salary into that conversation. Now, several states have already initiated what they call pay transparency laws. This means that on a job posting, the employer is legally required to include a salary range. You'll see most remote job postings with a salary range because the prospective employees could potentially live in a pay transparency state. So they need to be in compliance with those laws, even if the company is based in a different state. Now, if there is no salary listed, on a first interview, if interviewer doesn't bring up salary, I recommend against asking about it. It's just not proper, call it interview etiquette, to sort of make the assumption that you're in a position now to be evaluating whether or not the company meets your needs. The first interview is all about, do you meet their needs? On a second interview, more than likely, that will automatically be one of the topics covered. But if it isn't, then it's absolutely appropriate to ask about salary at that time. And keep it simple. When the interviewer asks if you have any questions, something like, may I ask what the salary range is for this position, would be perfect.
What?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go. No, you know what? I think you're going to say it. Go ahead. Keep going.
The other thing, because it kind of led me down that path. The other thing to keep in mind for salary range is, as you sort of broached on earlier, make sure that you are aware of what the mean or average salary range is for that position before you bring it up. So you need to know two things. You need to know what your salary range is, and then you need to know what the position's salary range is. And there are very easy ways to do that. If you've attended our previous webinars, you've already updated your budget, you've already taken into account all the factors of your salary needs, and you know exactly what your ideal salary is. Just turn that into a range, a little $10,000 to $20,000 buffer range, and that's what you need. Now, look up information about that position. Use Bureau of Labor Statistics, use Indeed or LinkedIn, and find out what the average salary range is for that position. And make sure that your range and the salary range match. And then another thing to be able to check is whether or not the salary range that may or may not be presented by the company is in line with averages. So if they're offering a particularly low salary range, then maybe you want to move on to somebody who's offering a more competitive wage anyway.
That's awesome. Okay. What if you are stumped on a question? They ask you something and you just don't know the answer. Is it ever appropriate to redirect a question, or what do you do in those situations?
I love this question because it happens. We are all human. None of us knows everything. Sometimes we know something walking into an interview and get nervous and forget. The most important thing in every single answer that you give during an interview is to be honest. So redirecting, you're not fooling anyone. Every interviewer knows when their question is not being answered and when it's being sort of worked around to, to be manipulated. So don't be afraid to repeat the question and take a moment to think. Don't be afraid to ask clarification questions. You can say to the employer, I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly what kind of answer you're looking for. Could you give me a little more detail? Could you explain to me a little more about what you're looking for in my response? ask specifics about the actual question that they ask. So don't be afraid to engage them a little bit to help you give them the response. And then don't be afraid to say, you know what, I don't really actually know the answer to that right off the top of my head. But when you do it, talk about how you'll find out when you're an employee. So these are the resources I know I'd be able to use to get that answer, even though I don't know it off the top of my head. Or I think that's one of those things that I'd have to enlist the help of a manager or someone who's got more time working on the job than I do to get a little help with perspective and with their experiences, because that not only speaks to your honesty and self awareness about not knowing the answer to the question, but also your willingness to ask for help when needed, and the fact that you're a team player and you know there are people who bring different strengths to the team.
Awesome. Okay. So there's some really good questions coming in the chat. And so I wanted to ask this one. Assuming I am interviewing with several companies, what is the best way to ask a company who offers you to wait? Because I want to see what the other companies are going to offer me.
That's a really good question, and it's
Mhm.
difficult. Some companies, and the truth is, some companies are just not going to want to wait. I don't
Mhm.
recommend saying you're not my first choice. That's
Mhm.
probably impolite. But the best thing to do is really just be honest and say, you know what, there's been a small change to my personal situation, and for personal, make it personal, right? Don't, disclose too much information, and just say, I actually am going to need a little bit more time before I'm able to commit to a start date. Would it be all right if I gave you an answer in X amount of time? And that would be, I would keep it very neutral. Um, say, reiterate that you're thrilled to be receiving the offer and thank you so much, but just explain, hey, something has changed personally for me and I just need a little bit more time before I can start. Is it all right if I give you my commitment in X amount of time?
Mhm. I can say that I did recently have this happen where someone needed more time and we went with someone else. So, um I guess it really depends. It's a really tricky one because
Hmm.
if you do that and then the other jobs don't come through, you might end up with nothing. So it's a little tricky, but you gave good advice. But we did have someone recently who said they needed a month or so to start, and we just didn't have that kind of time. We were ready to go.
And that's always a risk that you're gonna take, but
Mhm.
truly, that's why the constant reassessment of your position is so crucial, because
Mhm.
you need to know, can you afford to take those risks, right?
That's right. That's right. Okay, so there are a couple of more questions we could get to, but I want to give Maxine a chance to jump back in and talk about what happens next. And then, Maxine, it's up to you if you want us to answer any more questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for letting me step back in for a moment. And there have been some really fantastic questions and amazing answers that I think are going to be super helpful for just about everybody watching. I did want to quickly remind people because there were a couple of people that asked throughout the webinar. There is going to be a recording that is going to be sent out in a follow-up email in the next day or so. So do keep an eye out for that so you can always review any of the content that you missed, or maybe there was a question that you want to listen to again, you'll be able to go through that once more. Additionally, on our screen, you'll see some different social media pages for us on Instagram and Facebook. Definitely give us a follow there. We have a bunch of webinars that we do throughout the year. And if you follow us on our socials, you'll be able to see what other upcoming webinars we have in the near future. And you can always go to tutor.com/YouTube webinars. And that's where we have a list of basically all of our previous webinars that you can view. So again, if you missed any of the previous webinars in this series talking about making a career transition, resume or cover letter writing tips, all that kind of stuff can be found on our YouTube channel. Now, I think we have a time for one more question, Amy. If there was one from the chat that you thought was really good that you wanted to go over.
Okay. This one
They're all
says
good questions.
they are. They are. I've tried to answer some of them. There were a couple. I'll just say for everyone, should you put your picture on your resume? We were going to talk about that. I know that Rachel's talked about that in the other webinars, and we don't think so. We don't recommend you put a picture. Also, those really unique resumes with colors and columns and things like that. My opinion is if you're applying for a creative job, then that's one thing. But for most jobs, it's better to keep it simple. And I know that Rachel has talked about applicant tracking systems, and sometimes those don't read those kinds of resumes very well.
Mhm.
So you're taking a risk there if you have columns and things on your resume that the system will spit out something mumbo jumbo, weird stuff. And like we said,
Mhm.
if you're up against 1,000 people, they're not going to take the time to go back and try to figure out why your resume came out weird.
Right. And resumes with photos do have a rejection rate of 90%.
Woo! I did see a lot with photos. I didn't like any of them. I will be honest about that. And then the last question I see on here was there's a couple others. How are federal interviews different from other organizations? Do you know that answer, Rachel?
Federal interviews are different in every single way. And there's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. There are a few websites that can give you some really, I don't want to even start because then I'd have to just immediately stop. But so your federal resume is going to be completely different. A federal resume could be 6 or 7 pages long.
Wow.
The amount of detail that you'll need to provide about your background is extraordinarily different. They do get personal on occasion, depending, especially if there's a security clearance required. So it's a completely different animal. What I can do is provide Maxine with a few really great resources for federal resume prep and federal interview prep, and then she can distribute that along with the materials after this session.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. All of that will be we can include in that follow-up. So again, keep an eye out for that. I believe that is all the time that we currently have right now, but I did just want to thank Amy and Rachel for joining us today. Tons of great information, fantastic presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Maxine. Thanks,
you.
Amy.
All right.
Thanks for the
Thanks.
job.
All right. Everybody have a wonderful rest of the day.